Vale? She's too soft. Wouldn't last 5 minutes under fire. Sergeant Brig Lawson scoffed, his smirk curling like he'd already won the argument. He shook his head, adding, "Some people just aren't built for real combat." Hours later, under the burning Dara's sun, Samantha Vale's answer came, not with words, but with action. A bullet tore into her arm, another smashed her thigh, a third slammed her ribs, 2 more grazed flesh, 5 hits. And she kept moving. She hauled an unconscious SEAL across her shoulders, voice steady into the radio. "Battery Bravo, fire mission, danger close!" Artillery thundered. Enemy fire chased her, but she never slowed. By sundown, Lawson had nothing left to say. And can you guess what made him go silent like that? This is Veteran Biker. Comment 1 if you're new, 2 if you've been with us, 3 if you ride with us every week. Like, subscribe, and stay to the end. The air thrummed with the sound of incoming ordnance, a banshee wail that tore through the mountain stillness. Samantha Vale, her breath ragged and her muscles screaming, was a blur of motion behind a jagged cluster of rock. She wasn't just a soldier. In this moment, she was the fulcrum of chaos. The thin, fragile line between life and death, the arid landscape of Afghanistan, painted in shades of tan and brown, was now a canvas of violence. Blood, a dark stain against the dusty olive-drab fabric of her tank top, seeped from a gash in her left shoulder. Another crimson patch bloomed on her right thigh, a stark testament to the brutality she'd endured. Her face, smeared with dirt and sweat, was a mask of unyielding resolve. She was a woman pushed beyond all human limits, yet her spirit remained unbroken. With her right arm she gripped her rifle, its stock wedged against her uninjured side. The rifle felt like a natural extension of her body, a familiar weight in the storm. She fired off a short, controlled burst, a lethal whisper that silenced a distant muzzle flash on the high ground. Then, her free hand moved to her radio handset, a tool she'd once used for mundane communication, now repurposed for a desperate life-or-death chess match. "Fire Direction Center, this is Forward Observer 6 Charlie," she rasped, her voice a strained wire over the static. "I need a fire mission on Grid 167, Alpha Tango 149er. Danger close. Multiple enemy positions in the open. High explosive, proximity fused. Fire for effect now." The response was a clipped, professional affirmation. A pause stretched, pregnant with tension, before the thunderous roar of artillery erupted in the distance. The very ground trembled as high-explosive rounds impacted with terrifying precision, turning the ridgeline into a maelstrom of dust and shrapnel. Samantha didn't flinch. She had to believe that her calculations were perfect, that the artillery would strike the enemy and not the 2 fallen Navy SEALs she was fighting to protect. They were her only priority. 2 men, their names still just call signs, lying broken and vulnerable somewhere in the valley below. Their survival was the only thing that mattered. The pain in her wounds, a searing, throbbing fire, was just background noise to the singular, urgent mission pulsating in her mind. A bullet ricocheted off the rock shielding her, a sharp crack that sent a spray of pulverized stone into her face. She squeezed her eyes shut for a moment, the grit of the dust a painful reminder of her exposed position. This wasn't a skirmish, it was an ambush, a carefully laid trap sprung with devastating efficiency. The Taliban fighters, hidden in their elevated positions, had the tactical advantage. They were a hydra, and for every enemy she neutralized, another 2 would appear. But she wasn't alone. She was a radio, a gun, and a medic all in one. She was the anchor in a storm of lead and fire, a beacon of hope for 2 men who were depending on her, a woman who, in another life, was simply a communications specialist. Her emotional commitment to bringing her people home, the very trait others had once dismissed as weakness, had become her ultimate weapon. She had to move. The artillery barrage was a temporary reprieve, a fleeting moment of confusion for the enemy. She had a small window, and she knew she had to take it. She glanced down at her arm, at the messy, gaping hole where the bullet had exited. The pain was unbearable, but she pushed it down, locking it away in some remote corner of her mind. This was not the time for surrender. This was the time for action. She rose, her body protesting with every motion, and began a low crawl toward a new position. The terrain was unforgiving. Loose rock and thorny scrub tore at her pants, and the searing heat beat down on her back. She tasted blood from a superficial wound on her scalp, a relentless trickle that ran down her temple and into her eye. Her vision was starting to tunnel, her world shrinking to the few feet of ground in front of her. The constant, mind-numbing agony from her injuries threatened to overwhelm her, but she held on, clinging to her resolve with a white-knuckle grip. She was a ghost, a shadow moving through the dust and haze, her form nearly invisible against the unforgiving landscape. But even ghosts cast a shadow, and the Taliban fighters, relentless and determined, had spotted her. More rounds whizzed past her head, the distinct thwack of bullets striking the ground near her a grim soundtrack to her desperate journey. This was not a story of a soldier fighting with calculated efficiency. This was a tale of a human being fighting for survival with every ounce of her will. She was an underdog, fighting a battle that, by all accounts, should have been over. But for every step she took, for every bullet she fired, for every coordinate she called in, she was defying fate. She was the living, breathing embodiment of the hook line from the beginning of our story. They shot her 5 times. They believed she would fall. They assumed she would break. But she didn't. Instead, she carried 2 SEALs 3 miles through hell, while calling in artillery strikes every single step of the way. And now, as she prepared to make her final push, the story wasn't just about survival. It was about defining what it truly means to be a warrior. The narrative of this soldier, Samantha Vale, began with an ambush, but it was forged in the fire of her defiance. Her act of courage was born not from a desire for glory, but from a profound emotional commitment to the lives of others. This was the moment where her journey, her improbable quest for redemption began. This was the moment where she would prove that she was not a communications specialist who got lucky, but a warrior who had simply been waiting for the right moment to reveal her true strength. This was her crucible, and she had just begun to fight. The story begins earlier, a sunny morning at Forward Operating Base Daraz. The dust-choked air hung heavy with the promise of another scorching day. Inside the command center, the atmosphere was thick with the low hum of electronics and the focused energy of soldiers preparing for a day's work. It was an environment of practiced routine and professional detachment, a world where the emotional weight of war was compartmentalized, tucked away out of sight. Samantha Vale, a communications specialist, was a familiar sight here. Her presence was a constant, a quiet anchor in a sea of organized chaos. She sat hunched over a radio console, her notebook open, her pen poised. She was dressed in her standard uniform, tactical pants and a simple, low-cut olive tank top that was functional but did little to hide the subtle strength in her arms and shoulders. She was known for her exceptional technical skills, her uncanny ability to track signals and coordinate data faster than her peers. But what truly defined her was something deeper, something that made the hardened veterans around her uncomfortable. When reports of civilian casualties came in, her brown eyes would cloud with a sadness that was raw and genuine. When a fellow soldier was injured, her concern was transparent and unfiltered, a stark contrast to the stoicism that was so prized on the base. She felt everything too much, too openly, and this emotional transparency had earned her a reputation she could never quite shake. Major Cole Harridan stood at the front of the room, his weathered face a map of years spent in combat. He was a man of action and few words, a leader whose authority was earned, not given. He was laying out the details of a recon mission, his voice a low rumble that commanded attention. "We have intelligence indicating high-value targets in Sector 12. This is a joint operation with SEAL Team 7. I need absolute precision and complete situational awareness." Samantha listened, her mind already racing through the logistical challenges. She knew Sector 12 better than most. During her off-duty hours, she had pored over topographical maps, studying every ridge, every wadi, every potential ambush point. It was a compulsion born of her deep-seated desire to be ready, to be useful, to ensure that if something went wrong, she would have the knowledge to help. But she also knew her place. She knew what her role would be. When Major Harridan began reading the assignments, her pen hovered over the notepad, waiting for the familiar disappointment. Other soldiers were assigned to recon, to overwatch, to point communications. Then came her name, Vale. "You're managing base communications coordination, monitor all radio traffic and maintain situation reports for command." The familiar words hit her like a physical blow. She nodded, her expression professional and neutral, but inside she felt the familiar sting of being relegated to the sidelines. She was a supporting character in a drama where she yearned to be on the stage. As the briefing dispersed, she heard the whispers, the quiet assessments that confirmed her place. "Honestly, I'm glad Vale isn't coming with us," Sergeant Brig Lawson murmured to his partner. "Last thing we need in a firefight is someone breaking down when things get intense." His partner, Petty Officer Turner, shook his head in agreement. "She's solid with the tech stuff, but combat is different. When bullets start flying, you need people who can compartmentalize. She feels everything too much." Samantha pretended to organize her notes, but the words were a sharp, painful echo of every unspoken assumption about her. She understood their reasoning, even if she disagreed with it. In a life-or-death situation, emotional control was paramount. But what they failed to understand was that her emotional investment wasn't a weakness. It was her fire, her fuel. It drove her to be better prepared, more knowledgeable, more committed to bringing everyone home safely. That afternoon, while the recon team prepared their vehicles and checked their gear, Samantha threw herself into her work with a renewed intensity. She memorized every elevation marker, every potential cover position, every historical pattern of Taliban movement in Sector 12. She updated her knowledge of artillery positions and reviewed communication protocols until she could execute them in her sleep. Nobody had asked her to do this additional preparation. Nobody expected it. But for Samantha, being ready for opportunity or crisis was the only way to prove that her emotional investment was a strength, not a liability. The team departed at 1,400 hours, their vehicles disappearing into the shimmering heat of the Afghan desert. Samantha watched from the communications tent, her heart a heavy weight in her chest. She had no way of knowing that by sunset, everything would change. That the sunny afternoon would transform into the most intense combat situation of her military career. That her emotional investment, her obsessive preparation, and her refusal to accept limitations would become the difference between life and death for two Navy SEALs whose names she didn't even know yet. This was the prelude to her crucible, the calm before the storm that would forever redefine her purpose. The first indication of trouble came at 1,537 hours, crackling through the radio in the form of urgent, clipped voices that made Samantha's blood run cold. She was updating communication logs when Petty Officer Rodriguez's voice, tight with controlled panic, cut through the static. "Base, this is Recon Alpha. We are taking heavy fire. Repeat, we are under attack in Sector 12 Alpha." Samantha's hands flew across the radio console, her fingers moving with the speed and precision of a concert pianist. She adjusted frequencies, boosted signal strength, and established backup communication links. Her emotional response to the crisis, the very trait that others saw as a liability, now translated into hyper-vigilant focus. Every sound, every pause in transmission, every in vocal tone registered in her consciousness. Multiple hostiles, estimated 15 to 20 Taliban fighters. They were waiting for us, sir. This was an ambush. Rodriguez's voice was punctuated by the distinctive crack of rifle fire and the deeper boom of RPG explosions. We've got 2 men down, 1 critical, requesting immediate extraction and close air support. Samantha's heart hammered against her ribs, but her mind was a whirlwind of calm logic and lightning-fast calculations. The extraction team was 20 minutes out. That was too long. She knew the terrain of Sector 12, knew exactly where the secondary extraction point was located, and could visualize the likely Taliban positions based on the sound patterns coming through the radio. She was already calculating firing solutions before anyone even asked. This wasn't her job, but it was her mission. This was the moment she had been preparing for, the moment when all her hard work would either be dismissed as irrelevant or become the one thing that saved them all. Her story, a narrative of quiet competence and unspoken courage, was about to be rewritten in a blaze of fire and blood. She was the unseen hero, the silent guardian in a world of loud action. Her role, once relegated to the shadows, was now taking center stage. The story of Samantha Vale, the communications specialist who was deemed too emotional for combat, was about to begin its most dramatic chapter. The radio room, moments ago a place of routine discipline, now crackled with a frantic, desperate energy. Every soldier had turned towards the comms console, their faces etched with a shared sense of dread. Major Harridan's voice, a steady baritone, cut through the din from the command center next door. "Recon Alpha, this is base. What's your situation?" Rodriguez's strained voice replied amidst the chaos of gunfire, "Negative, sir. Position is compromised. We're moving to a secondary extraction point, but we've got wounded who can't move fast. We need artillery support to clear our 6. Samantha's fingers were a whirlwind of motion across the communication board. She was already calculating firing solutions in her head, the complex three-dimensional puzzle of terrain, target coordinates and gun positions coming together with stunning speed. Months of obsessive study, dismissed as an eccentric hobby, had prepared her for this precise, terrifying moment. She didn't need a computer. She saw the battlefield in her mind's eye with vivid clarity. She spoke into her headset, her voice calm and authoritative despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "Rodriguez, this is base communications. What's your exact grid reference?" A new voice, confused and strained. "Cut back. Who is this?" "This is Vale. I need your precise location for an artillery mission." "Grid reference now!" Her tone left no room for argument. A beat of silence, broken only by the sharp, metallic sounds of battle. Then Rodriguez's voice returned, professional even in the face of imminent doom. "Grid reference 41, RQQ1, 234567890. But Vale, you're not certified for artillery." "I've got it," she interrupted, her hands already inputting the coordinates into the fire direction system. The protocols, the certifications, the official chain of command, they were all irrelevant in the face of 2 men fighting for their lives. She could hear the Major's voice in the background, a distant, frustrated sound as he tried to locate the official artillery coordinator. There was no time for proper procedure. The lives of American soldiers hung in the balance, and she was the only one who could save them. Then a transmission came through that made the blood freeze in her veins. "Base, we've got a bigger problem. SEAL Team 7 is also in Sector 12, and they're not responding to radio calls." Last known position was grid 41RQ156789123. A cold dread formed in the pit of her stomach. The SEALs, operating on a separate mission, were less than 2 miles from the ambush site. If their comms had gone dark, it meant they, too, were in mortal peril. Her mission had just expanded from saving one team to saving two. Major Harridan, his voice a tight coil of tension, ordered the recon unit to continue their retreat while he desperately tried to raise the missing SEALs. For 10 agonizing minutes, Samantha listened to the increasingly frantic radio chatter, her mind a high-speed processor, tracking both teams simultaneously. She was a master puppeteer, a hidden hand guiding the action from afar. But as the desperate calls from the pinned-down SEALs grew weaker, a new, more terrifying truth became clear. Any station, this is SEAL Team 7. We are down to 2 effectives with multiple wounded. Request immediate assistance. Grid reference 41RQ145678912. The voice was a ghost in the static, weak and barely audible. Samantha triangulated their position instantly. The SEALs were in a ravine, approximately 3 miles from the nearest friendly forces, with no clear way to escape. The extraction team was already committed to Rodriguez's position. Helicopter support was 20 minutes out, but the SEALs, surrounded and running out of ammunition, didn't have 20 minutes. The artillery she was using couldn't fire on their position without risking friendly fire. A single, unavoidable conclusion crystallized in her mind, a terrifying thought that filled the room with a suffocating silence. Someone had to go to them. Someone had to reach the SEALs, provide immediate medical assistance, and help them fight their way out. Someone who knew the terrain, someone who could navigate the treacherous landscape and communicate with both the SEALs and command. As these thoughts solidified, Samantha looked up. Every person in the communications center was staring at her, their faces pale, their eyes wide with a shared, unspoken dread. They had all reached the same conclusion, but the thought was unthinkable. It would mean abandoning her post, disobeying a direct order, and charging headlong into the most dangerous combat situation the base had faced in months. Samantha glanced from the radio console to the tactical map, a stark digital representation of 2 teams of American soldiers fighting for their lives. Her emotional commitment to their survival, the same trait others had mocked as weakness, now burned with the force of an unshakable resolve. She stood up. She began to gather her gear, her movements fluid and deliberate, a testament to her hours of off-duty practice. She strapped on her tactical vest, its familiar weight a grim comfort. She checked her rifle, ensuring every component was in working order. Her hands, so often used for delicate electronic work, moved with a different, more lethal purpose. She was a different person now, not a communications specialist, but a warrior. "Jones, what are you doing?" Sergeant Williams asked, his voice a mix of disbelief and alarm. "I'm going to get them," she replied, her voice filled with a calm, steely determination that surprised everyone in the room. "You can't just leave your post." "You're not authorized for field operations," Williams protested, his words a desperate, futile attempt to cling to order and protocol. "And Major Harridan specifically assigned you to communications coordination." Samantha paused, her preparations complete, and looked directly at Williams. "Sergeant, those SEALs have maybe 15 minutes before they're overrun. The extraction team is committed elsewhere. Air support is 20 minutes out, and artillery can't fire danger close without killing them. Someone has to reach them now." "That someone isn't you!" Williams shot back, his voice rising in panic. "You're communications, not infantry. You've never been in actual combat." The words stung because they were true. She had trained extensively, had excelled in every simulation, but she had never faced live enemy fire. Her emotional nature had always kept her from the sharp end of military operations. But as she listened to the increasingly desperate radio calls from the pinned-down SEALs, Those very emotions that others saw as a flaw now hardened into an unyielding, unbreakable purpose. "I know the terrain better than anyone else on this base," she said, shouldering her pack. "I've memorized every route, every elevation, every piece of cover between here and their position. I can navigate there in 30 minutes. "Jones, this is insane," another comm specialist interjected, his voice trembling. "Even if you could reach them, what then? You can't carry 2 wounded SEALs by yourself." Samantha finished her equipment check and turned towards the exit, her eyes a mirror of unwavering resolve. "Then I guess I'll figure it out when I get there." As she reached the door, Williams called out one last time. "What do I tell Major Harridan when he asks where you've gone?" Samantha paused without turning around, her voice a final, resolute whisper. "Tell him I went to bring our people home." And with that, she stepped out of the communications tent and into the blinding afternoon sun, a lone figure setting off on a suicide mission. The distant echoes of gunfire, once just a terrifying sound on the radio, were now the soundtrack to her desperate, defiant march. She was no longer just a soldier. She was a force of nature, a one-woman army guided by a moral compass that pointed only to one thing: saving lives no matter the cost. Her defiance wasn't reckless. It was a choice born of certainty, a conviction that some rules were meant to be broken when the alternative was to do nothing at all. Her story, a testament to the power of a single person's will, had officially begun. The path she now walked was her own, and she would follow it to the end. Stepping out of the comms tent and into the blinding midday sun, Samantha felt the desert heat hit her like a physical blow. The air, thick with dust and the smell of hot sand, shimmered over the endless undulating landscape. The forward operating base, a collection of HESCO barriers and prefab buildings, shrank behind her. She was now alone, a solitary figure against the vast, indifferent expanse of the Afghan wilderness. Her emotional commitment had pushed her to this point, but now she had to rely on a different kind of strength, her knowledge. Her movement was not hurried, but deliberately quick and efficient. She had no time for hesitation. The rhythmic sound of her boots on the hard-packed earth was a metronome counting down the precious minutes she had left. The route to the SEAL's last known position was a path she had traced 100 times on a map, but had never seen in person. She navigated by instinct, by a deeply ingrained mental map of the terrain that had been etched into her mind over months of dedicated study. Every hill, every rock outcropping, every dried riverbed was a familiar landmark in her internal cartography. The landscape, deceptively peaceful under the relentless sun, was in reality a labyrinth of potential threats. Every rise in the ground could conceal an enemy fighter, every gully a deadly ambush. She moved with a silent, graceful efficiency, her body low, her senses on high alert. Her tactical pants, worn but sturdy, protected her legs from the thorny vegetation that clung to the dry slopes. The straps of her pack dug into her shoulders, a constant physical reminder of the weight of her mission. She was no longer just a technician, she was a ghost in enemy territory, a hunter moving toward her prey. 20 minutes into her movement, the distant rumble of combat, once a faint echo, began to grow louder. The distinctive rapid crack of M4 carbines was a clear call to action, mixed with the heavier, more sinister report of AK-47s. The sounds told her that the SEALs were still fighting, still alive. The sound was her grim compass, pulling her forward with renewed urgency. She keyed her radio, keeping her voice low and measured, a stark contrast to the chaotic battlefield she was nearing.
SEAL Team 7, this is base communications.
I am approximately 1 click from your position. Approaching from the southeast. What's your tactical situation? The response came almost immediately, strained with pain and exhaustion. Base communications, this is Chief Petty Officer Daniel Rourke. We're in a ravine with steep walls on 3 sides. Enemy has the high ground, and we're running low on ammunition. 2 of my men need immediate medical attention." "Copy that, Chief," she replied, her voice unwavering. "I have medical supplies and can provide artillery coordination. Hold your position. I'm coming to you." There was a moment of silence, a pause filled with the static of disbelief. Then Rourke's voice returned, confusion overriding his combat-hardened calm. "Base communications, did you say you're approaching our position? Are you part of the extraction team?" Samantha smiled grimly to herself as she navigated around a cluster of boulders that would have been invisible on satellite imagery, but were clearly marked on her mental map. "Negative, Chief. I'm just a soldier who refuses to let good people die on a sunny day." Her words, simple and direct, were a powerful declaration of her purpose. She wasn't an extraction team. She wasn't a hero. She was simply someone who saw a need and refused to let bureaucracy stand in her way. The final half-mile to the SEALs' position was the most treacherous yet. The ground became a jumble of jagged rocks and steep slopes, a maze of natural choke points that funneled movement into predictable, dangerous routes. The intensity of the firefight ahead increased, punctuated by angry shouts in Pashto, the chilling sounds of the Taliban coordinating their assault. She was no longer just hearing the battle, she was a participant, an unseen player moving into position for the most desperate of gambits. She crested a small ridge, and the tactical situation spread out below her like a deadly diorama. The SEALs were pinned down in a narrow ravine, using shattered rocks and a destroyed vehicle for cover. On the surrounding high ground, the muzzle flashes of enemy fighters marked their positions, an arc of fire that had the Americans completely surrounded. She could see 2 of the SEALs lying motionless, a grim sign of the casualties Rourke had reported. The situation was deteriorating rapidly. Conventional rescue was not an option. But Samantha hadn't come this far to attempt a conventional rescue. As she studied the enemy positions, calculating firing solutions for the artillery support she would need, a profound sense of clarity washed over her. This moment, born from her emotional investment in the lives of these men, would be the defining moment of her life. She was no longer the quiet technician in a comms center. She was a warrior, a medic, an artillery coordinator, all rolled into one. And her mission to bring these men home was the only thing that mattered. She keyed her radio once more, her voice a beacon of hope in the darkness of the ravine below. "Chief Rourke, this is your backup." "I am in position to provide fire support and medical assistance. Get ready to move your wounded. We're going home today." Her words were a promise, a vow made to men she had never met. The battle that had seemed lost now had a new, unexpected player. Samantha Vale, the soldier they said was too emotional for combat, was about to prove that her empathy was not a flaw, but a wellspring of strength more potent than any weapon. The stage was set, the players were in place, and the final desperate act was about to begin. Her journey of defiance was about to become a story of impossible courage. Perched on the high ground, Samantha's heart pounded a frantic rhythm against her ribs. But her mind was a pool of glacial calm. She was a single, defiant silhouette against the glaring sun, an uninvited guest at a deadly party. The tactical display below was grim Petty Officer Turner and Petty Officer Mason, as yet just names from a radio, were the 2 motionless casualties. The ravine was a textbook kill zone, with enemy fighters holding the high ground on 3 sides, their positions well camouflaged among the ancient rock formations. The SEALs were trapped, a pack of lions surrounded by a ring of vipers. But Samantha had seen something in her extensive off-duty reconnaissance of the topographical maps that the Taliban likely didn't know. The ravine, carved by the powerful seasonal floods that swept through the region, had a narrow, almost invisible drainage channel running along its eastern edge. It was a secret passage, a natural scar on the landscape that offered concealed movement. This unmapped erosion channel was a flaw in the enemy's otherwise perfect ambush, and it was only passable for someone of her smaller size. It was an advantage born not of brute force, but of meticulous, obsessive knowledge. With a grim smile, she keyed her radio to the artillery coordination frequency. "Fire Direction Center, this is Forward Observer 6, Charlie. I need an immediate fire mission. Grid reference 41RQ1 456789012. The surprised voice on the other end was Major Harridan's. "Vale, this is FDC. You're not certified as a forward observer, and we show you assigned to base communications." "FDC, I have eyes on a dozen-plus enemy fighters engaging friendly forces," she replied, her voice cutting through his protests. "I need high-explosive rounds, proximity-fused, targeting the northern ridgeline. Danger close. Friendlies are 300 meters south of the target area." The weight of military procedure pressed down on the conversation, a heavy hand of bureaucracy threatening to crush the lives below. "Vale, danger. Close artillery requires authorization from a qualified forward observer or field commander. We cannot process this request." A new voice, strained and filled with the fatigue of a losing battle, cut in. "FDC, this is Chief Petty Officer Rourke. I'm authorizing Vale as our forward observer. We need that fire mission now. The tension broke. Roger, Chief. Jones, send your fire mission." The FDC coordinator, now following Rourke's direct order, was ready. Samantha's obsessive study of artillery procedures, once a peculiar hobby, now became the key to saving lives. She rattled off the coordinates with practiced ease, a lethal poetry of numbers and vectors. "Fire mission grid 41RQ1 460891050. Enemy personnel in the open. High explosive, proximity fused. 3 rounds. Fire for effect." The response was a clipped, shot out. "Chief Rourke, artillery rounds incoming." 30 seconds, she announced, her voice a calm signal in the storm. "When they impact, I'm moving to your position via the drainage channel on your eastern flank." "Negative base communications," Rourke shot back immediately. "That approach is covered by enemy fire. You'll be walking into a kill zone." "Chief, trust me on this one," Samantha insisted, her gaze fixed on the hidden path. "I've studied this terrain for months. There's a concealed approach the enemy can't observe." The thunderous impacts of the artillery rounds shook the ground, sending clouds of dust and debris boiling into the sky. Muzzle flashes from the northern ridgeline ceased abruptly as the Taliban fighters scrambled for cover. It was the moment of chaos she had been waiting for. She used the brief window to descend into the ravine, following the concealed drainage channel she had identified on the maps. The route was a test of both agility and courage. The loose rock threatened to send her tumbling into the open, and thorny vegetation tore at her uniform, but the channel provided the concealment she desperately needed. Halfway down, the crack of a rifle fire echoed through the gully, a bullet tearing through her sleeve and a fresh, searing pain blossoming in her left upper arm. The Taliban had spotted her movement. She became a shadow, a whisper of a target, low-crawling the remaining distance. Finally, she dropped into the ravine, her body a symphony of aches and injuries. Chief Rourke stared at her, a mixture of disbelief and awe on his face. "I'll be damned. You actually made it. Chief, status of your wounded?" she demanded, immediately shifting into medic mode as she assessed the 2 motionless SEALs. She was no longer the communications specialist, but a combat medic, her training taking over. Her tank top, now dark with sweat and dirt, clung to her body, a testament to her grueling trek. Petty Officer Turner had an AK round to the chest, his body armor having absorbed most of the impact, but he was unconscious and breathing shallowly. Petty Officer Mason had caught shrapnel from an RPG in his leg and abdomen, his condition critical. Samantha moved to Mason first, applying pressure bandages to his wounds. The shrapnel had torn through his uniform, but the injuries were manageable with proper first aid. The real challenge was not the wounds themselves, but the impossible task of carrying 2 grown men out of this deadly trap. "Chief, I need to call in more artillery to suppress the enemy positions. Then we're going to move these men out of here," she said, her voice steady as she worked on Mason's bandages. "Move them where?" "We're completely surrounded, and extraction is still 15 minutes out." Samantha pointed toward the drainage channel she had just used. "That route leads to a natural defensive position 500 meters south, better cover, a clear field of fire, and accessible to helicopter extraction." Rourke shook his head, a grim, weary expression on his face. "Even if that route is concealed, we can't carry 2 critical casualties up that slope under fire." "We're not going up," Samantha replied, finishing her work on Mason. "We're going through—" She keyed her radio again, her voice a beacon of hope in the heart of the ravine. "FDC, this is Forward Observer 6 Charlie. I need continuous suppression fire on multiple targets. Stand by for coordinates." As she began calling in a complex fire mission, she realized that her intense emotional investment in these men had led her to this exact moment. She was a culmination of her preparation, her courage, and her unyielding resolve. Every ounce of her being, from her encyclopedic knowledge to her physical endurance, had converged in this ravine. She was the hero they never knew they had, a silent warrior who refused to let others fall. The sustained artillery bombardment was a symphony of destruction, a wall of deafening sound that ripped across the ridgelines. Dust and earth flew skyward, forcing the Taliban fighters to seek deeper cover and temporarily halting their assault on the ravine. In the brief, precious moments of calm, Samantha finished her medical assessment. Mason, the SEAL with shrapnel wounds, was stable but would need surgery within the hour. Turner, unconscious from a bullet absorbed by his body armor, was breathing but couldn't walk. Both men were dead weight, and the ravine's unforgiving terrain made carrying them a near impossible task under fire. Her own body, a roadmap of fresh injuries, protested with every movement. A crimson stain was spreading across the olive tank top covering her left bicep, a constant throbbing reminder of the bullet that had torn through her arm. The cut on her scalp bled relentlessly, a warm, sticky trickle running down her temple. But the pain, a blinding white fire, was a challenge to be overcome, not a reason to quit. The emotional core of her being, the deep-seated need to protect her people, was a powerful, inexhaustible fuel. "Chief, I need you and your men to lay down covering fire toward the northern positions while I move Turner," she told Rourke, her voice a calm instruction amidst the storm. She began to shoulder her rifle and prepared to lift the unconscious SEAL. Rourke, his face a mask of disbelief, shook his head. "You can't carry him alone. Turner weighs close to 200 pounds with his gear. That's more than you weigh." Samantha looked at the unconscious SEAL, then back at Rourke. A flicker of something unbreakable shone in her eyes. "Chief, I didn't come this far to leave anyone behind. Trust me." She had trained for this exact scenario in her off-duty hours, pushing her body beyond what anyone would have considered possible for someone her size. Her obsessive preparation, born of her desire to be ready for any contingency, had forged her into a physical force that defied conventional expectations. Using a fireman's carry, a technique she had perfected through countless hours of sweat and pain, she lifted Turner onto her shoulders. The weight was immense, but her technique distributed it across her frame with a surprising efficiency. More importantly, her sheer, bloody-minded determination to save his life gave her a strength that pure physical training couldn't provide. She gritted her teeth against the agony in her wounded arm, the raw effort of the lift sending fresh waves of nausea through her. "Moving now," she announced, her voice a strained whisper, and began the treacherous journey through the drainage channel. The route was a nightmare of loose rock and thorny vegetation. Every step had to be calculated, every handhold tested, before she committed herself and Turner's substantial weight to the precarious footing. A fall here would mean death for both of them, and she knew it. Behind her, Rourke and his men maintained a steady stream of suppressive fire against the Taliban positions. The crack of their M4 carbines was a reassuring sound, a shield of noise that masked the labored sounds of her movement. The artillery strikes continued to impact around the enemy, creating confusion and preventing them from organizing an effective pursuit. Halfway through the movement, disaster struck. A loose rock gave way under her boot, and she slid sideways toward an exposed area where Taliban fighters would have a clear shot. With Turner on her shoulders, she couldn't use her hands to break the fall. Instinctively, she used a technique she'd learned from rock climbing, shifting her weight and using her powerful legs to redirect the slide toward a cluster of boulders that offered concealment. The maneuver worked, but the impact sent a shock of excruciating pain through her ribs and left shoulder. She bit back a cry, a metallic taste of blood filling her mouth, and kept moving, propelled by an iron will. Stopping was not an option. When she finally reached the defensive position she had identified, a natural rock stronghold with excellent cover, she carefully lowered Turner behind the large rock wall. He was still unconscious, his breathing shallow but steady. The position was everything she had hoped for, defensible, with clear sight lines and accessible to a helicopter extraction. "Chief Rourke, I'm in position with Turner," she radioed, her voice breathless but steady. "The defensive position is secure. Bring Mason and your team when you're ready." "Outstanding work, Vale," Rourke replied. "We're beginning movement now." But as Rourke's team started their own movement, the Taliban fighters began to adapt to the new tactical situation. The artillery barrage had disrupted their initial assault, but they were now repositioning, their disciplined, lethal minds working to maintain the pressure. Samantha could see muzzle flashes from new positions. A cold, hard truth that the enemy was attempting to cut off the SEALs' movement. Rourke's covering fire was becoming sporadic as his team focused on their own retreat, leaving gaps the Taliban were quick to exploit. "FDC, this is Forward Observer 6 Charlie," she called into her radio, her voice sharp with urgency. "I need immediate shift fire to new target areas. Enemy is repositioning to intercept friendly movement. Stand by for coordinates." As she began calling in new coordinates, she realized with a grim certainty that the enemy had identified her position. Rounds began to impact around her defensive stronghold, sending fragments of rock flying and forcing her to keep her head down while simultaneously treating Turner's wounds and coordinating fire support. The next few minutes would test every ounce of her will, every moment of preparation, and every drop of determination she could summon. The Taliban fighters were closing in, Rourke's team was exposed, and the extraction helicopter was still 10 minutes away, but Samantha had come too far to fail now. Her emotional investment in the mission, the very thing that had brought her to this moment, was a fire in her soul, a powerful, unyielding force that transcended her physical injuries. She keyed her radio one last time, her voice steady despite the chaos. All stations, this is Forward Observer 6, Charlie. We're bringing everyone home today. Just hold on a little longer. Her words were not a plea, but a vow that would be tested in the moments to come. The Taliban fighters regrouped with a speed that spoke of discipline and lethal experience. As Chief Rourke's team began their cautious movement with Petty Officer Mason, enemy fire began to concentrate on their route, forcing the SEALs to take cover in positions that offered minimal protection. From her defensive stronghold, Samantha could see the deadly stalemate unfolding below. The SEALs were pinned in the drainage channel, unable to advance or retreat without exposing themselves to a hail of concentrated gunfire. The extraction helicopter was still 8 minutes away, a lifetime in this brutal calculus of combat. Samantha keyed her radio, her voice a tight knot of focused urgency. "Chief Rourke, what's your ammunition status?" Rourke's voice, tight with stress, came back. "We're down to 2 magazines per man. Mason is conscious but can barely walk. We need covering fire to complete the movement." Samantha assessed her options with a fierce clinical detachment. The artillery support was effective, but it couldn't provide the precise, continuous suppression needed to cover the SEAL's short dash to her position. The enemy fighters were too close for danger-close artillery strikes. What the situation required was direct, accurate small arms fire from a position that could suppress multiple enemy locations simultaneously. The answer, brutally clear and terrifyingly simple, stared her in the face. She looked at her own rifle, then at the terrain between her position and the Taliban fighters. She could provide the covering fire Rourke needed, but it would mean exposing herself to return fire from at least 8 enemy positions. Given her size and the amount of open ground she'd have to cross, survival would depend entirely on speed, accuracy, and the element of surprise. "Chief," she announced, her voice a final, resolute whisper, "I'm going to provide covering fire for your movement." "Negative, Vale," Rourke replied immediately, his voice filled with a desperate protest. "You're already in a good defensive position. Don't expose yourself unnecessarily. Chief, with all due respect, those fighters have you pinned down and you're running out of ammunition," Samantha insisted. "Someone has to take the initiative." She didn't wait for a response. She moved to the edge of her defensive stronghold and began engaging the nearest Taliban fighter positions with carefully aimed single shots. Her marksmanship training, honed through hundreds of hours of practice that others had dismissed as excessive, now paid immediate dividends. Her first shot eliminated a fighter who had been directing fire at Rourke's position. Her second took out a machine gunner who had been suppressing the drainage channel. Each shot was calculated, precise, designed to maximize tactical effect while conserving ammunition. The Taliban fighters, quick and adaptable, instantly identified her as a threat and began concentrating their fire on her position. Rounds impacted around her, sending rock fragments flying and forcing her to constantly shift her position to avoid presenting a static target. The pain from her wounds, a constant low-grade throb, flared with every jarring movement. But her covering fire had the desired effect. Rourke's team was able to advance through the channel, carrying Mason between them, while Samantha's accurate shooting kept the enemy fighters focused on their own survival rather than offensive action. "Vale, we're moving," Rourke called over the radio. "Keep that fire coming." Samantha continued to engage targets, her emotional investment in the mission translating into a level of focused intensity that surprised even her. Every shot mattered. Every target eliminated brought the SEALs closer to safety. Every second of suppression bought precious time for extraction. But the Taliban fighters were disciplined and experienced. They began to coordinate their fire, forcing Samantha to take cover while simultaneously trying to maintain suppressive fire. It was a deadly mathematics problem with no perfect solution. That's when the first round found her. The AK-47 bullet struck her right side, just below her body armor, a sledgehammer blow that spun her around and sent her rifle clattering across the rocks. The impact felt like being hit by a freight train, and the immediate shock made her vision blur momentarily. But even as a wave of excruciating pain flooded her system, her mind remained focused on the mission. Rourke's team was still 50 meters from her position, still vulnerable to enemy fire. Mason was unconscious and depending on her medical care. The extraction helicopter was still 5 minutes away. She retrieved her rifle with her good arm and continued firing, using her right hand to maintain weapon control while her left arm hung useless at her side. The agony was incredible, but her emotional investment in saving these men overrode everything else. The second round hit her in the left side, nearly dropping her to the ground. The third caught her in the right thigh, a searing punch that made her legs feel like jelly. The fourth round grazed her head, sending blood streaming down her face and making her ears ring. But Samantha Vale refused to fall. Her body was failing, but her determination remained absolute. As Rourke's team finally reached her defensive stronghold, carrying Mason between them, she continued to provide covering fire despite her wounds. "Jesus Christ, Vale!" Rourke exclaimed when he saw her condition. "You've been hit multiple times." "I'm fine," Samantha replied, though blood was now pooling beneath her position. "Get Mason ready for extraction. Helicopter's 3 minutes out." She wasn't fine. She was bleeding from 4 separate wounds. Her vision was starting to tunnel from blood loss, and her left arm was completely useless. But the mission wasn't complete, and her emotional investment in bringing everyone home alive wouldn't let her quit. Rourke stared at Samantha in disbelief as blood continued to seep through her tactical vest. "Vale, you need immediate medical attention. You're bleeding out." "Negative," she replied, her voice steady despite the shock beginning to set in. "Turner and Mason are the priority for extraction. I can wait." She was lying, and they both knew it. The wound in her left side was bleeding heavily, and the graze to her head had left her dizzy and disoriented. But her training had taught her to compartmentalize pain and focus on the mission objectives. The extraction LZ was 200 meters south of their position, a relatively flat area that would accommodate a helicopter landing. But they would never make it carrying 2 wounded men while under fire. "Chief, how much ammunition do you have left?" she asked, reloading her own rifle with movements that were becoming increasingly clumsy as blood loss affected her coordination. "Maybe 60 rounds total for the whole team," Rourke replied grimly. "Not enough for a sustained firefight." Samantha keyed her radio with her good hand. "FDC, this is Forward Observer 6 Charlie. I need immediate suppression fire. Walking barrage from grid 41 RQ1 4608920 to grid 41 RQ1 4808994. Duration 5 minutes, continuous fire." "Vale, that's a lot of ordnance," came the reply from Fire Direction Center. "Are you sure about those coordinates?" "FDC, I have multiple friendly wounded requiring extraction. I need that barrage to cover our movement to the LZ. Fire for effect." As the artillery began impacting in a steady rhythm designed to suppress enemy movement across a wide area, Samantha struggled to her feet. The pain from her wounds was becoming overwhelming, a blinding white-hot fire, but her emotional investment in saving these men provided a strength that pure adrenaline couldn't match. She moved toward the unconscious SEAL, using her functioning right arm and compensating for her wounded left side, and managed to get Mason into a modified fireman's carry. The position put an enormous strain on her wounded shoulder, but she gritted her teeth and began moving toward the extraction zone. The journey across 200 meters of broken terrain, carrying an unconscious man and bleeding from multiple wounds, was the most difficult physical challenge of Samantha's life. Every step sent a jolt of agony through her body, and her vision began to blur from blood loss. But her emotional connection to the mission, the same trait that had made others question her combat readiness, now provided the psychological strength to push through physical limitations that should have been insurmountable. Behind her, she could hear Rourke's team moving with Turner, their progress slow but steady. The artillery barrage was working, keeping the Taliban fighters suppressed and unable to mount an effective pursuit. Halfway to the extraction zone, Samantha's legs gave out. She collapsed to her knees, still holding Mason, her body finally beginning to shut down from shock and blood loss. "Vale," Rourke called out, seeing her fall. "Keep moving," she replied, forcing herself back to her feet through pure determination. "Don't stop for me." The sound of helicopter rotors began to fill the air as the extraction aircraft approached the landing zone. Samantha could see the 60 Black Hawk in the distance, its crew chief already preparing for a hot extraction under fire. But the Taliban fighters had also heard the helicopter and were attempting to break through the artillery barrage to engage the aircraft. Muzzle flashes appeared from positions that the indirect fire hadn't been able to suppress, and Samantha could see tracer rounds beginning to arc toward the approaching helicopter. "Chief, the helicopter's taking fire," she called over the radio. "They need immediate suppression on the northern ridgeline." Rourke's team was focused on moving Turner and couldn't provide effective covering fire. The helicopter crew was trained for hot extractions, but sustained accurate fire could force them to abort the mission. Samantha looked at Mason, unconscious in her arms, then at the helicopter crew risking their lives to save them. Her emotional investment in bringing everyone home alive crystallized into one final surge of determination. She carefully lowered Mason behind a rock outcropping, then raised her rifle and began engaging the Taliban positions that were firing at the helicopter. Her marksmanship, even with a wounded shoulder and failing vision, was still accurate enough to suppress the enemy fighters. Each shot sent agony through her wounded shoulder, and each muzzle flash revealed her position to return fire, but Samantha continued shooting, providing the covering fire necessary for the helicopter to complete its approach. The Black Hawk touched down in a cloud of dust and rotor wash, its crew chief jumping out to assist with loading the wounded. Samantha maintained covering fire until the last possible moment, then collapsed as exhaustion and blood loss finally overwhelmed her system. The crew chief reached her just as she lost consciousness, her rifle still clutched in her right hand. Blood had soaked through her tactical vest and was pooling beneath her position, creating a crimson stain against the Afghan desert floor. "We've got multiple wounded," the crew chief shouted over the rotor noise to the flight medic. "This one's critical." Chief Rourke appeared beside them, helping to lift Samantha toward the helicopter, while his remaining SEALs provided security. "She carried Mason 200 meters with 4 gunshot wounds," he told the flight medic. "She's been coordinating artillery and providing covering fire for the last 30 minutes. The flight medic's eyes widened as he assessed Samantha's injuries during the short sprint to the aircraft. "How is she still conscious?" the medic asked, applying pressure bandages as they loaded her into the helicopter. "She's not anymore," Rourke replied grimly, "but she stayed conscious long enough to get us all out." As the Black Hawk lifted off from the landing zone, the flight medic worked frantically to stabilize all 3 wounded soldiers. Mason was responding well to treatment. Turner was conscious and stable, but Samantha was rapidly going into shock from blood loss.
"How far to the trauma center?"
the medic called to the pilots.
12 minutes, came the reply. "We're pushing maximum speed."
The medic looked at Samantha's pale face and weak pulse. 12 minutes might be too long. She'd lost a significant amount of blood, and her blood pressure was dropping dangerously low. But she was still fighting, her body refusing to quit even in unconsciousness. Chief Rourke knelt beside her stretcher, holding pressure on her side wound. "Come on, Vale," he said quietly. "You didn't carry us this far to give up now." He knew that the girl they had called too emotional had just accomplished a feat that would be spoken of for generations, a silent act of defiance that had saved them all. The extraction zone, a desolate patch of ground 200 meters south, seemed an eternity away. As the Black Hawk helicopter descended, a dark smudge against the sun-scorched sky, its powerful rotors churned the air into a chaotic vortex of dust and debris. The sound of its approach was a beacon of hope, but also a dinner bell for the enemy. Taliban fighters, in a final desperate push, began to break through the suppressing artillery barrage, their muzzle flashes blooming like deadly nightshade along the ridgeline. The air filled with the angry buzz of rounds as they arced toward the vulnerable aircraft. Inside the Black Hawk, the crew chief prepared for a hot extraction, his face grim with focus. He knew the risks. He knew that the only thing separating him from a hail of bullets was the thin, tenuous line of suppressive fire provided by the ground team, a line that was now faltering under the enemy's renewed assault. On the ground, Samantha, her body battered and her mind swimming in a haze of pain and blood loss, saw the tracer rounds from the ridgeline reaching for the helicopter. Her vision was a blur of tunnel vision and static, the world shrinking to a small circle of terrifying clarity. Rourke's team, struggling with the unconscious Turner, couldn't provide effective covering fire. The helicopter crew was trained for this, but a sustained, accurate barrage could force them to abort the mission, leaving all of them behind. Her emotional investment, the deep-seated vow to bring everyone home, ignited one final surge of strength. It was a primal, unwavering resolve that transcended the agony of her 5 gunshot wounds. She carefully lowered the unconscious Mason behind a rock outcropping, her good arm trembling with the effort. Raising her rifle, she began to engage the Taliban positions that were firing at the helicopter. Her marksmanship, a skill honed through countless hours of quiet practice, was still accurate, still lethal, even with a wounded shoulder and failing eyesight. With each shot, a white-hot agony flared through her wounded shoulder, a cruel fire that threatened to consume her. Each muzzle flash from her rifle gave away her position, inviting a fresh wave of return fire. But Samantha continued shooting, providing the vital covering fire necessary for the helicopter to complete its approach. She was the one-woman army they never knew they needed, a human shield made of flesh, blood, and a will of iron. The Black Hawk touched down in a storm of dust and rotor wash, its powerful engines roaring. The crew chief jumped out, a blur of motion as he raced to assist with loading the wounded. Samantha maintained her suppressive fire until the last possible moment, her rifle feeling impossibly heavy in her hands. Then, as the crew chief reached her, she finally collapsed, the exhaustion and blood loss overwhelming her shattered body. The rifle fell from her grasp, her consciousness fading into a sea of red. The crew chief, a battle-hardened veteran, reached her just as she lost consciousness. He took in her blood-soaked uniform, the crimson stains spreading across the dusty earth beneath her. "We've got multiple wounded," he shouted over the deafening noise to the flight medic. "This one's critical." Rourke, his own face grim with fatigue and disbelief, appeared beside them, helping to lift Samantha toward the helicopter. She carried Mason 200 meters with 4 gunshot wounds, he told the medic. "She's been coordinating artillery and providing covering fire for the last 30 minutes. The flight medic's eyes widened as he assessed Samantha's injuries during the short, frantic sprint to the aircraft. Gunshot wounds to her left upper arm, right thigh, left side, and a graze to her scalp that had left a bloody trail down her face. Her 5th round had slammed into her right shoulder during the final push, a fresh wound that pulsed with a life of its own. "How in the hell is she still alive?" the medic demanded, applying pressure bandages as they loaded her into the Black Hawk. "She's not anymore," Rourke replied, a grim reverence in his voice. but she stayed conscious long enough to get us all out. As the Black Hawk lifted off from the landing zone, taking fire from Taliban positions that had managed to reposition despite the artillery barrage, the flight medic worked frantically to stabilize the 3 wounded soldiers. Mason and Turner were both stable, but Samantha was rapidly going into shock from blood loss. "How far to the trauma center?" The medic called to the pilots. 7 minutes. We're pushing maximum speed." The medic looked at Samantha's pale, sweat-streaked face. 7 minutes might be too long. She'd lost a significant amount of blood, and her vitals were dropping dangerously low. Her body, having been pushed to its absolute breaking point, was now shutting down. But even in her unconscious state, there was a fierce, unwavering refusal to quit. Rourke, now a figure of quiet strength, knelt beside her, holding a pressure dressing on her side wound. "Come on, Vale," he whispered. "You didn't carry us this far just to give up." He knew that the soldier who had once been dismissed as too soft had just accomplished a feat of impossible heroism, an act of defiance that had saved them all. During the flight back to the forward operating base, Rourke began to piece together the full scope of what Samantha had accomplished. She'd left her assigned post without authorization, navigated 3 miles of hostile terrain alone, coordinated complex artillery fire missions, under pressure, provided medical treatment under fire, and carried 2 wounded SEALs to safety while absorbing 5 gunshot wounds herself. It was the kind of performance that military legends were built on, accomplished by someone who had been dismissed as too emotional for real combat operations. Rourke, seeing the raw, blood-stained courage of the woman on the stretcher next to him, knew one thing for certain: they were wrong about everything. Her emotional commitment, her raw empathy, was not a weakness. It was her greatest strength. It was the fire in her soul that had allowed her to push past the limits of physical endurance and stare death in the face without flinching. Her story was not just about survival, it was about the power of an unbreakable will forged in the crucible of compassion. The helicopter touched down at the forward operating base's trauma center 8 minutes later, where a full surgical team was waiting. As medical personnel rushed the wounded into the facility, the word of Samantha's actions began to spread like wildfire. Major Harridan, who had spent the last 4 hours coordinating search and rescue operations, stood on the landing pad, his face a mask of shock and awe. His communications specialist, the woman he had assigned to equipment manifests because she was deemed too emotional for field operations, had just accomplished the most daring rescue mission in the base's operational history. Sergeant Brig Lawson, a mix of shame and admiration on his face, approached the major with a radio handset. "Sir, Colonel Helena Cross from Regional Command is on the line. She wants a full debrief on the rescue operation." Harridan took the handset, his mind still reeling from the magnitude of what had occurred. "Colonel, this is Major Harridan. The rescue operation was successful. All personnel extracted safely. I understand one of your soldiers conducted an unauthorized solo rescue mission," the colonel replied, her voice sharp with authority. "What's the status of that individual?" Harridan looked toward the trauma center, where Samantha was fighting for her life. "Sir, Specialist Vale is currently in surgery. She sustained multiple gunshot wounds during the operation." "Vale? I don't see a Vale on your operational roster for today." "No, sir. She wasn't on the operational roster. She was assigned to base communications. She conducted the rescue mission without authorization." There was a long pause before the colonel responded. "Major, are you telling me that a communications specialist single-handedly rescued 2 Navy SEALs from a Taliban ambush?" "Sir, that's exactly what I'm telling you, and she did it while coordinating artillery fire and treating wounded under enemy fire." Another pause. The silence stretched, a heavy blanket of disbelief. I'm going to need a very detailed report on this incident, Major. This kind of initiative is either going to result in a court-martial or a medal. Possibly both. As Harridan ended the radio call, he realized that Samantha's unauthorized rescue had created ripple effects that would extend far beyond their small forward operating base. Her actions would be analyzed, debated, and ultimately judged by people who hadn't been there, who hadn't heard the desperation in the SEAL's radio calls, or witnessed the impossible determination that drove her to attempt what everyone else said couldn't be done. But none of that mattered right now. What mattered was whether the woman who had proven that emotional investment could be the ultimate combat strength would survive long enough to face the consequences of her extraordinary courage. Her story, born of defiance, had now entered the annals of military history. Her journey from overlooked specialist to legendary warrior was a testament to the power of one person's will to change not just a single battle, but the very hearts and minds of those who believed they knew the limits of human strength. The final chapter of her story had yet to be written, but the opening lines were already carved in blood and courage. She had not only saved lives, she had redefined what it meant to be a hero. The surgery lasted 6 grueling hours. Samantha's injuries, while not individually life-threatening, had combined to cause massive blood loss and trauma. In the medical corridor, Chief Petty Officer Daniel Rourke, along with Petty Officer Mason and Petty Officer Turner, refused to leave, their presence a silent testament to their gratitude. When the lead surgeon, Dr. Fiona Park, finally emerged, her exhaustion was palpable. "She's stable," Dr. Park confirmed, her voice a wave of relief. "She'll need extensive physical therapy for the shoulder, and there will be scarring, but she should make a full recovery." The surgeon, however, was baffled. "I'm still trying to understand how she remained functional with those injuries. Most people would have gone into shock and collapsed." Rourke, a grim smile on his face, replied, "You'd have to know her to understand, Doc. That woman doesn't quit when people are depending on her." When Samantha finally regained consciousness, her first question wasn't about her condition, but about the well-being of the 2 SEALs. Are Turner and Mason okay? Her concern, a trait once seen as a weakness, was now the truest measure of her strength. Rourke, sitting by her bedside, looked at her with a profound sense of awe. "Vale, you just performed one of the most remarkable rescue missions in military history. What you did out there was extraordinary by any standard." He saw in her not a communications specialist, but a warrior whose emotional investment was a force more powerful than any weapon. Meanwhile, the military command grappled with the unprecedented situation. Major Cole Harridan, fielding calls from senior officers, had to confront his own biases. Sergeant Brig Lawson, after reviewing Samantha's training records, had come to a humbling realization. "Sir, her marksmanship is in the top 5%. Her physical fitness exceeds all combat standards. We were wasting her abilities." Harridan nodded grimly, understanding that he and others had misjudged her, mistaking her emotional depth for a lack of toughness. 3 days after her surgery, Colonel Helena Cross, the investigating officer known for her no-nonsense approach, arrived to interview Samantha. In a tense meeting, Samantha, still in a wheelchair, calmly defended her actions. "Ma'am, I believe that soldiers would die if I didn't act. I had the skills and knowledge to help them, and I made the judgment that saving their lives justified the risk." Colonel Cross pressed her on the matter of insubordination, but Samantha's answer cut to the heart of the issue. Dying soldiers don't care about job classifications. They need help from whoever can provide it. The interrogation room fell silent. In the end, Colonel Cross's report was not a recommendation for a court-martial, but an astonishing proposal. Specialist Vale, your actions were unauthorized, but also extraordinarily courageous. This board finds that while your methods were unacceptable, your results demonstrate capabilities that have been underutilized. You are being transferred to Special Operations Command for advanced training. The news was a profound vindication. Samantha's emotional strength, her unwavering commitment to her comrades, was no longer a liability. It was a strategic asset. 6 months later, Samantha, now an elite special operations soldier, stood in a briefing room at Fort Bragg. The scars on her body were a roadmap of her journey, a testament to her courage. Her fellow trainees, all seasoned soldiers, initially viewed her with skepticism, but her performance in a simulated casualty evacuation exercise quickly earned their respect. When asked how she knew her unconventional solution would work, she simply replied, "I didn't. But I knew that accepting failure wasn't an option when someone needed help." News of her success filtered back to her former base. Rourke, Mason, and Turner, all of whom had requested to be assigned to her future team, followed her progress with pride. They knew that her determination was not learned in training. It was simply a part of who she was. Samantha's story sparked institutional changes throughout the military. Training programs began to emphasize adaptability and psychological resilience, and leaders reconsidered the traditional view of emotional detachment. Her example proved that physical size and gender were no longer limitations, and that a soldier's deepest feelings could be their greatest strength. The girl they had dismissed as too emotional had become the colonel they called when caring enough was the only thing that mattered. The story of Samantha Vale is a powerful reminder that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the unwavering choice to act in spite of it. It's a testament to the fact that emotional strength, when properly channeled, can be the most formidable force on the battlefield. She proved that a soldier's true power lies not in their ability to shut down, but in their refusal to give up on those who depend on them. Thank you for joining us on Veteran Biker. Your support allows us to continue sharing these incredible stories of heroism and sacrifice. If this story moved you, please consider subscribing and leaving a comment below with your thoughts. What part of Samantha's journey resonated with you the most? We invite you to check out our other videos on your screen right now. Until next time, stay safe and keep the rubber side down.